Sleep was the farthest thing from her eyes, and her mind was sharper than ever. However, for the initial time since Milligan had been admitted injured, his state was no longer her primary concern. Something preoccupied her at the moment of his awakening, completely excluding everything else. The man lay motionless, his eyes fixated on the ceiling. He made no attempt to move, and although he was fully conscious, there was no curiosity or inquiry in his demeanor. He accepted his situation like a newborn awakening from a restful night's sleep. To be honest, his weakness held him captive, draining any natural inclination from his mind and body. All his awakening brought him was a vague recollection of a disturbing dream, along with a backdrop of the events at Willow Bluff. If the man was troubled by a bad dream, the expression on the girl's face indicated the horrifying reality of her thoughts. There was something more than fear in her eyes, the furrowing of her brows, and the tenseness of her lips. There was a mixture of terror and confusion in the deep brown eyes that stared at the wall in front of her. Every now and then her delicate figure visibly shuddered. Her mind feverishly replayed scenes similar to those in her patient's dream, but for her, they were terrifying truths that she had witnessed just a few hours earlier in that very room. In that moment, she would have sacrificed her own life to consider them mere dreams. Her lover's life had been endangered by the heartless act of reopening his wound. Would she ever be able to forget the horrific scene? Never. Time and time again, her mind vividly depicted each detail, causing her physical anguish. From the moment she unexpectedly awoke, still propped against the foot of her bed, to the culmination of the despicable incident in the sick room, it was like living through a never-ending nightmare. She recalled the sudden jolt that had caused her to open her eyes. As far as she knew, she hadn't heard anything. Nothing had disturbed her. Yet there she was, sitting upright, fully awake, listening intently. Then she rushed to the lamp. Her guilty feelings, the unconscious stealth of her tiptoeing to the landing outside, her horror at the discovery that her obstruction to the staircase had been removed, and the chairs, as though to mock the childishness of her scheming, set in orderly fashion, side by side against the wall to make way for the midnight intruder. The closed door of the sick room, which yielded to her touch and revealed the apparition of her father bending over her boyfriend, and with no uncertainty of movement, removing the bandage from the wounded neck. The terror of it all remained. As long as she lived, she could never forget one single detail of it. Even now, though hours had passed since these things had happened, the nervousness with which she had finally approached the task of readjusting the bandage still possessed her. And even the gratitude with which she discovered that the intended harm had been prevented was not enough to bring her more than a brief satisfaction. She shuddered and nervously turned to her patient. Then it was that she became aware of his return to life. "Jack, oh, thank God," she murmured softly. And the sound of the beloved voice roused the patient's interest in the things around him. "Where am I?" he asked in a weak whisper, turning his eyes to the face so anxiously regarding him. But Heather's troubles had been lifted from her shoulders for the moment, and the nurse was uppermost once more. She signaled to him to keep quiet while she administered the doses Doc. Osler had prepared for him. Then she answered his question. "You are in the room next to mine," she said calmly. Her intuition warned her that no more reassuring information could be given him, and the result justified it. He smiled faintly, and in a few moments his eyes closed again, and he slept. Then the girl got to work in earnest. She hurried downstairs and shared the good news with Joe. She went to find Lonnie to send someone to fetch the doctor. For now, all her troubles were forgotten as she was grateful that her lover had come back to life. As she left the house, the sunlight seemed to celebrate with her. The old familiar buildings appeared more welcoming in their plain, unyielding appearance. Even the ugly enclosures seemed less like prisons, and the branding forges seemed less cruel. But the most surprising thing was Lonnie's response when she made her request. The giant smiled at her and granted it without hesitation. Overjoyed, the young woman smiled back and thanked him sincerely. However, her happiness was short-lived, and her gratitude was premature. "I'm almost glad that guy is recovering," Lonnie said.
"Man, he's something." He looked away, avoiding her smiling gaze, and continued in a tone that he tried to make regretful. I guess I was starting to dislike him. We haven't exactly gotten along. I suppose it's mostly anger between us. Anyway, I guess it can't be helped now that he's leaving. Leaving? The girl asked. She knew he would be leaving, but she wondered what Lonnie meant. Of course, the foreman said, returning to his usual manner. Your father is really against him. I've seen William Selby furious, but I've never seen him as mad as he is at your boyfriend. Once Milligan recovers, he'll have to leave quickly. I've been wondering what made your father like that. I hope you haven't been foolish enough to tell him that Milligan has been courting you. The girl's smile disappeared, and her beautiful eyes turned to a look of cold disdain as she replied defiantly. Lonnie listened to her response with a smile on his confident face that clearly revealed his intention to hurt her. Whatever happens, Mr. Milligan won't leave our house until the doctor arrives. Osler gives the word. Maybe it will be helpful for you to further understand that the doctor won't give that word until I choose. You're a silly girl, Lonnie exclaimed angrily. Then he became scornful. I don't care that much for Milligan now. Nevertheless, he gave a vicious snap with his fingers as he flicked them in the air. I wish him well enough. I have a reason to. Let him stay as long as you can keep him. Yes, go right ahead and treat him, and give him medicine. And when he's well, he's going for sure. And when he's out of the way, maybe you'll see the advantage of marrying me. How's that, huh? There, he went on tauntingly, as he saw the flushing face before him and the angry eyes. Don't get mad, though I don't know but what you're a beautiful-looking girl when you're mad. Go right ahead, ma'am, and take care of the boy. I guess it's all you'll ever do for him. Heather had fled before the last words came. She had to, or she would have struck the man. She knew only too well how right he was about Milligan, but this cruelty was unbearable, and she went back to the sick room completely deprived of the last bit of happiness she had left it with. The doctor came and brought some comfort with him. He told her there was nothing to be considered now but the patient's weakness and the cleaning of the wound. In his abrupt manner, he suggested a diet and ordered certain medication, and finally left, telling her that since her room was next to her patient's, there would be no need to stay up at night anymore. And so 3 weeks passed. 3 weeks of quick recovery for Milligan, even if they were spent very differently by many of the settlers in the area. Truth be told, it was the stormiest time the country had ever experienced. The payment the night riders had received at Willow Bluff seemed to have driven them insane with a desire for revenge, which they proceeded to exact in a very characteristic manner. Up until now, their crimes had been infrequent, with long periods of time passing between them. But now, 4 attacks occurred, one after another. The police were completely defied as the rustlers stole cattle and mercilessly shot anyone who tried to defend them. These criminals acted without restraint wherever they pleased. The sheriff brought in reinforcements, but this only served to anger the ranchers even more due to their utter failure. It seemed as if the actions of the raiders were a direct challenge to all forms of authority. A reign of terror began, and settlers who had been in the area for years declared their intention to leave and find a place where they could at least have protection for their lives and property, even if it meant paying more for their land. This was the situation when Milligan found himself granted the freedom to move around his room and sit in a comfortable armchair by his open window, basking in the delightful sunlight. He was not kept in the dark about the raiders' activities. He and Heather discussed them passionately. However, she took care to keep him unaware of anything regarding herself and her father. He knew nothing of the latter's disapproval of his presence in the house, and he knew nothing of the blind man's threats or the terrible attack he had carried out in one of his fits of uncontrollable anger. These days, which were so delightful for both of them, filled with happiness for him and a mixture of pain and sweetness for her, had passed by almost unnoticed and uncounted. But like all such overshadowed moments of joy, their end came quickly and mercilessly. The signal was given during the midday meal. The rancher, who had not mentioned Milligan's name since that unforgettable night, got up from the table to retire to his room. At the door he paused and turned. "That guy, Milligan," he said in his smooth, even voice. "He's well enough to go to the dormitory. Take care of it. And he left the girl devastated and powerless. It had finally happened. She knew that she could no longer keep her lover by her side. Even Dr. Osler couldn't help her. And besides, if she refused to obey, her father wouldn't hesitate to handle the situation his own way. So, with a heavy heart, she went upstairs for the afternoon. This intimate conversation had become their daily routine, she with her sewing and the sick man enjoying a pipe. Milligan was still wrapped in bandages, but only lightly, as the wound was almost healed. The girl took her usual position, and Milligan moved his chair next to the small table where she placed her work, facing her. He loved to gaze at her sad little face. He loved to say things that would bring a smile to it, replacing the shadows with a pretty smile. And it had been so easy for him. The simplicity, honesty, and single-mindedness of this prairie flower made her very susceptible to happiness, even in her troubled surroundings. But he knew that these moments were only temporary, and to make them last, he had to find a way to take her away from that world of cruelty to a place where she could bask in love and the warmth of a happy home. During his recovery days, he planned and schemed for the fulfillment of his dreams. But today, he found her more challenging. Her eyes were a little sadder, and the smile wouldn't appear to chase away the shadows. The sweet mouth, which always had a slight droop at the corners, seemed to droop more than usual today. He attempted, fruitlessly, every subject that he believed would captivate her, but eventually he himself began to feel the despair that seemed to burden her so heavily. And oddly enough, this disheartening influence brought forth in his mind a disturbing recollection, which had previously slipped his memory. It was the dream he had the night before he woke up, and almost instinctively, he spoke of it. "Do you recall the day I awoke to find myself here, Danny?" he said. "It just occurred to me now that I wasn't unconscious the entire time before. I distinctly remember dreaming. Perhaps I was only asleep." The girl shook her head. "You were more than asleep," she said ominously. "Regardless, I vividly recall a dream I had. I would say it was a nightmare. It involved your father. He had me by the throat. And what's wrong?" Heather flinched, and to Milligan's alarm, appeared as though she might faint. However, she quickly recovered. "Nothing," she said. Just I can't bear to think about that time, and then Father strangling you. Don't dwell on your dream. Let's discuss something else." Milligan's alarm immediately lessened. He chuckled softly and leaned forward to kiss her. "Our future, our little home. Right, my dearest?" he suggested tenderly. She returned his embrace and made a feeble attempt to smile into the eyes that gazed so eagerly into hers. And now, for the first time, her lover began to comprehend that something was truly wrong with her. It was that look, so longing, so pleading, that aroused his apprehension. He urged her to confide in him until, overcome with anguish, she could no longer keep it from him. "It's nothing," she stammered with quivering lips. Observing her countenance with the jealousy of a lover, he remained silent, for he knew that her initial words were merely her way of preparing for something she deemed serious. "Jack," she said eventually, focusing all her attention on her work, "you've never inquired about me at all. Isn't that strange? Maybe you're not interested, or maybe," her head bent lower over her work, "you, with your kind heart, are willing to trust me. However," she continued, before he could interrupt her, "I intend to tell you what you refuse to ask. No," as he leaned forward and kissed her again. "Now sit up and light your pipe. There are to be no disruptions like that." She smiled sadly and gently pushed him back into his chair. "Now," she began, as he settled himself to listen, "I must go back a very long way, before I was born. Father was a sea captain back then. First the captain of a whale ship, then he bought a ship of his own and traded around the East Indies. He often used to talk about those days, not because he had any desire to tell me about them, but it seemed to help him when he was in a bad mood. I don't know what his occupation was, but I think it was quite thrilling. He often spoke of the dangers, which, he said, were well compensated by the money he made." Milligan smiled solemnly. "And Father must have made a lot of money at that time, because he married Mother, bought himself a nice house and land just outside Kingston in Jamaica. and I believe he had a whole army of black servants. Yes, and he has told me not once but many times that he blames all his misfortunes on the day he married my mother, which always seems unfair to her in any case. Somehow I can never imagine Father as ever being kind, and I'm sure poor Mother didn't have an easy time with him. However, it's not my place to criticize. She paused, but continued almost immediately. Let me think. It was right after the honeymoon that he left on his final trading trip. He was supposed to visit Java. Lonnie was his buddy, you know, and they were expecting to come back in 6 months with a valuable yield of what he calls black ivory. I think it was some local creation because he had to visit the local villages. He told me so. But the journey was abandoned after 3 weeks at sea. Father was struck down with yellow fever, and since that day, he has never seen daylight again. The girl put her work aside and continued in a gloomy manner. When he recovered from the fever, he was brought home, as he said himself, a blind wreck. Mother nursed him back to health and strength, but she couldn't restore his sight. I am sharing these details as I have gathered them from him during moments when he chose to be talkative. I also imagine, from the hints he dropped when he was angry, that all this time he lived in a state of helpless anger towards the world, towards God, but especially towards the one person he should have been most grateful for, Mother. All his friends abandoned him because of his bitter temperament, everyone except Lonnie. Finally, in desperation, he came up with the idea of going to Europe. Initially, Mother was going to accompany him, but even though he could easily afford the extra expense, he begrudged it and changed his mind, deciding to go alone. He sold his ship, settled his affairs, and embarked on his journey. For 3 years he traveled around Europe, visiting every renowned eye specialist in all the major cities. But it was all in vain, and he returned even more embittered than when he left. It was during his absence that I was born. Once again, Heather paused. This time, several moments passed before she continued. To add to his troubles, she finally resumed in a soft tone. Mother was seriously ill when he returned, and on the day he came back, she passed away in his presence. Since then, no matter what his temperament was before, it appears to have worsened exponentially. And now, when he is angry, he takes a sadistic pleasure in discussing the intense hatred and disgust that the people of Kingston held for him, as well as the animosity he harbors towards humanity in general. According to his own accounts, he must have been truly dreadful. However, this is not relevant to our history. Personally, I can only recall this ranch, but I understand that he attempted to resume his previous occupation in the West Indies. For some reason, this endeavor failed him. Difficulties arose, and he ultimately gave it up for good and settled in this country. Once again, to quote his words, away from the individuals and circumstances that drove him to madness. That, she concluded, is a brief summary of our history, and it sounds like the kind of tale I would envision your father to have. A most unhappy one, Milligan commented calmly. Yet he marveled at the naivety of this young girl who failed to comprehend the true meaning of black ivory. For a short while, silence hung between them as they both gazed out the window. Eventually, Heather turned, and when she spoke again, there was a foreboding trembling of her lips. "Jack," she said, "I haven't shared this with you without a purpose." "No, I gathered that, dear," he replied. "And what is this profound purpose?" he inquired, smiling. Her response took a long time to manifest. The task she had to perform was incredibly difficult. "Father doesn't approve of you," she finally uttered in desperation. Milligan set aside his pipe. "It doesn't seem to me that he approves of anyone very much, unless it's Lonnie, and I wouldn't bet on the strength of their affection. He prefers Lonnie over anyone else. At least he trusts him, which is a fair equivalent in his case. But what makes you think he dislikes me more than most people? You remember that night in the kitchen when you asked me to marry? Yes. Could I ever forget it?" Milligan had taken possession of one of the small hands lying in the girl's lap, but she gently withdrew it. "I was crying, and then you saw the bruises on my arms. Father disapproved of my talking to you." "Ah, I understand." And he added under his breath, "The jerk. He says I must give you up." Milligan was looking straight ahead at the window. Now he turned slowly and faced her. His expression conveyed nothing. "And you?" "Oh, it is so difficult!" Heather burst out in distress. "And you make it more difficult." "Yes," she continued miserably. "I have to give you up. I must not marry you. I cannot—" "Cannot?" The question came without the movement of a muscle. "Yes, he says so. Oh, don't you see? He is blind, and I am his only— Oh, what am I saying?" Milligan shook his head. "I'm afraid you are saying a lot of nonsense, little woman. And what is more, it is a lot of nonsense I'm not going to take seriously. Do I understand that you are going to leave me simply because he tells you to?" "Not only because of that." "Who told him about us?" "I don't know." "Never mind. Perhaps I can guess. You have grown tired of me already?" "You know I haven't, Jack." Heather put out a hand and gently laid it on one of his, but his remained unresponsive. This sudden awakening from his dream of love had more than startled him. It had left him feeling resentful against somebody or something. At present he was not sure who or what, but he meant to have it out, no matter the cost. "That's all right, then," he said. "Now tell me this other reason," he said eagerly, leaning forward and locking eyes with her. His hands, now slender and delicate, held hers tightly in a passionate grip, and his face radiated with the authenticity and intensity of his love. "Remember," he said, "this is no child's game, Danny. I won't easily let you go. I may be weak, but I still have fight left in me. As long as I know you love me, I swear nothing will separate us. I love you like I've never loved anyone before, and all I want is you. Now please tell me this other reason, my dear." But Heather hesitated, her distress evident. Her lover's heart ached at the sight. He now realized that something very serious lay behind her hesitation. He had never seen anything so pitiful as the expression she wore as she turned to him, attempting to delay. "Father says you have to leave this house today, and after that you'll be expelled from the ranch. It's only because the sheriff supported the doctor's orders that you weren't already thrown out of here." Milligan remained silent for a moment, then burst into a harsh, joyless laugh. "So," he exclaimed, his laughter abruptly fading. "Listen to me. Your father can kick me out of this house, but he can't force me off this ranch. I've paid for my residence here for the next 3 years. The agreement is signed and sealed. No, let him try another bluff." His tone then softened, adopting a persuasive manner. "But you haven't revealed the true reason, my dear. Speak up. I can sense it's a bitter revelation, something that not only terrifies you with its consequences, but something else as well. Tell me, Danny. Whatever it is, you can trust me. My love for you is unwavering. Believe me, nothing will come between us." His voice was filled with tenderness, and Heather couldn't help but shed 2 tears as she listened. He had backed her into a corner, leaving her with no way out. Nevertheless, she made one last attempt to avoid revealing her shameful secret. "Can you not trust my words, Jack?" she pleaded. "Not in this case, my love," he responded. He spoke firmly, yet his voice carried an overwhelming amount of love, causing the tears that she had been holding back to burst forth. He allowed her to weep, believing it would be cathartic for her. After some time, when her sobs subsided, he gently encouraged her again. "Tell me," he whispered. She stuttered. The man displayed remarkable patience. "Oh, please don't make me say it," she cried. "Yes, I must." And finally her answer came in the faintest of whispers. My father is only my legal father. He was away for 3 years. I was born 3 days before he returned." Well. Milligan remained motionless for a moment, while the young girl trembled under the weight of her mother's shame. Suddenly, he reached out and embraced her tightly. "Oh, Danny," he exclaimed, holding her close. "I have never felt such happiness in my entire life as I do now, knowing that William Selby is not your father." "But the shame of it!" the girl cried, believing that her lover hadn't fully grasped the situation. Shame, he retorted, holding her even tighter. "Never let me hear that word pass your lips again. You are the most genuine, sweetest, and purest person in the world. You are mine, Danny, completely mine. And let me make it clear that I have won you and will cherish you until my last day on earth." Now she knelt beside him, her face buried in his chest, crying tears of relief and joy. and Milligan gently kissed her, pressing his cheek multiple times against the soft curls that surrounded her head. Then, after some time, he sat gazing out of the window with a determined, unwavering gaze. Despite his own weakness, he was prepared to fiercely fight for this child who nestled so confidently in his embrace. Chapter 19. The most exciting thing that had happened to the men on the ranch in a very long time was Milligan's return to the bunkhouse. He was greeted with great enthusiasm. Although he had found it difficult to part with Heather under uncertain circumstances, there was some consolation, certainly satisfaction, in the wholehearted welcome from his rough comrades. It was not the outpouring of emotions they displayed, but the deliberate nature of their reception that revealed their true feelings. Teddy Jinks refused to serve the dinner until Milligan had everything he needed. Lou Cawley cleaned a plate for him as a special favor, and Raw Harris, despite being a pessimist who made it known in all the little everyday matters of life, sharpened a knife for him by thrusting it deep into the hard-packed earth and cleaned the tines of a fork with the edge of his suede shirt. However, he couldn't violate his principles without justifying himself, which he did by saying that he believed sick folks need exceptional nourishment. Jacob Smith, who usually enjoyed his evening meals seated at the base of the upright log that served as part of the door frame, which his broad shoulders covered in a polished sheen, gave up his coveted spot in favor of the invalid. Milligan was an honored guest, for whom, on this occasion at least, nothing was too good. And in this position, Arizona supported him, cursing the flies that fell into his friend's cup of tea, and hooking them out with the tip of his greasy knife as he sat on his log beside him. Joe, too, had come down specifically to share the meal, but he, being a member of the household, was considered insignificant at the bunkhouse, and Milligan was thrilled by the kindness shown to him. The release from the sick room did him good. The air was refreshing, the simple, nutritious food was satisfying, but most importantly, those tanned, resilient faces around him seemed to rejuvenate his weakened body. He realized that it was high time for him to get back to work, and there was plenty for him to learn. Every man among them had something to contribute to the general conversation, and in their usual manner proceeded to dish it out without considering the audience, contradicting, interrupting, cursing, until the unfortunate man who was the target of their remarks found himself almost overwhelmed by the chaos. Finally, Arizona brought them to attention with one of his sudden outbursts. "Hey!" he exclaimed, his eyes glaring fiercely and encompassing the whole group with a sweeping glance. "You guys are like a pack of scavengers around a bone. I know Milligan may not be in the best shape right now, but he can still hear. You're just a bunch of uneducated vagrants." This attack had the effect of reducing the pandemonium, but it did not dampen the spirits of the party. It served as a challenge, which Jacob Smith promptly accepted. "Hey, boys," he shouted, "we're going to get an education from Arizona." His remark was met with a mocking burst of laughter at Arizona's expense, but as soon as it had subsided, the ridiculed one fired back his retort. "There are things and creatures in our country that we never thought to educate, like pigs," Jacob responded, undeterred by the insult. The boys acknowledged Jacob's point and laughed at Arizona's expense. He had stumped the cowboy, who now eagerly joined the argument with good-natured enthusiasm. "Hey," he remarked, "I haven't had much to do with your folks, Jacob, but if you're talking about the truth, it seems like your family doesn't have it." "Just call him a pig outright, Arizona," Raw chimed in lazily. "I'm not calling Jacob a pig. That would be an insult to the pig," the quick-witted man remarked. "Hello, Jacob," Lou exclaimed, as the laughter turned towards him this time. But Arizona didn't appreciate the interference and immediately confronted him. "Hey, you preacher guy, I haven't heard that it's your country's way to butt in and encourage people to fight. It's usually said that you're the one ready to fight." "What does that mean?" Lou grinned widely. "Well, it mostly means let's hear from you firsthand." "It's not very useful to hear from me about hogs. They aren't popular in my country. Besides, you seem to be quite familiar with them." Arizona stood up, approached the bulky figure of the pastor's son, and extended his hand. "Shake," he said, with a grin that caused his weathered skin to crease fiercely. "We live in the same place." Lou laughed along with the others, and when the laughter subsided, he remarked, Listen, Arizona, when it comes to talking about pigs, you're in a league of your own. The entire Northwest defers to you on that subject. Now go and take a seat like a peaceful citizen, and remember that a man who is an expert in the craft of pig farming, who has lived with them, bred them, fed on them, and whose mindset is focused on them, has no right to criticize innocent, uneducated individuals like ourselves. It's not fair. Arizona stood up. He looked at the man, then he glanced at each face around him and noticed the smiles. One hand went up to his long black hair, and he scratched his head, while his intense eyes settled on Milligan's broadly grinning features. Suddenly he walked back to his seat, picked up his plate of food, and continued his dinner, making a final comment as he ate. Language? Wow! I disagree. And for the rest of the meal, the topic of pigs was not mentioned. They thoroughly discussed the current issue. The night riders occupied their thoughts to the exclusion of everything else, and Milligan learned the details of their recent actions, as well as the opinion of each man on the crimes. Even Teddy Jinks, young and inexperienced as he was listened to, as these men were completely absorbed in their cattle world. I believe, the thin youth said with great certainty, they're preparing for a confrontation. I'd bet one of Arizona's pigs that there won't be any more rustlers around by the fall. Things are intense, and they're going to leave, taking everything they can right now. It was comforting to listen to the rough conversations of these companions once again. So comforting that Milligan extended this, his first meal with them after such a long absence, until the very last possible minute. Then he reluctantly filled his pipe, put away his plate and cup, and walked over to the barn with Arizona. He went to inspect his mare. He was fond of her, and rightfully proud of her. Despite her occasional mood swings, she was an exceptional animal. Arizona had informed him about how she had brought both of them to the ranch from Willow Bluff on that memorable night. It's a shame that Sheriff Guy didn't catch her when he found Red Mask's trail, Arizona remarked, as he watched Milligan gently run his hands over each leg one by one. Clean, huh? He asked. Yep, legs like a racehorse. Has she been ridden while I've been sick? Nope, she's just been chowing down on oats. I'll have a tough time when I get back in the saddle. They moved outside and stood by the door, fully visible from the house. The evening was getting darker. The sun was setting on the horizon, and the purple shades of the night were spreading across the eastern sky. Arizona, Milligan said a little later. I have an unpleasant task ahead of me. I just saw Selby pass by the window of his office. I need to talk to him. I think I'll go now. About the lady? The cowpuncher asked. You got it. We'll go right ahead. I'd rather it be you than me, I reckon. Anyway, I'll stay right here. Maybe I'll be useful if you need me. Milligan chuckled. Oh, it's fine, he said. I'm not dealing with Lonnie. Nope, the other replied, settling himself on a saddle. Then, after a moment of reflection, which is unfortunate, Milligan walked towards the house. He was weak and made the journey slowly. He also didn't feel at ease. However, he was doing what he knew was right, and as he reminded himself with regret, doing one's duty was rarely pleasant. His purpose was simply a formality, but one that, if omitted, would give Selby a reason to say things. Moreover, in fairness to Danny and himself, he had to seek her father's approval for their engagement. And as he thought about how pointless it was, he bitterly laughed to himself. Didn't the rancher already know? And hadn't he fully explained his stance on the matter? Arizona watched as Milligan stumbled unsteadily towards the house, silently criticizing his foolishness. Joe joined him, having also witnessed Milligan's visit. The small man gestured towards Milligan's retreating figure and asked, Where is he going? I reckon it's about the lady, Arizona curtly replied. And he was kicked out because of her, the other added significantly. Reminds me of a terrier, Joe remarked. Yep, or a cow with a calf, Arizona agreed. Except he doesn't cause a fuss. I reckon it's a terrier. Joe emphasized his final decision with a nod. Meanwhile, the subject of their conversation had reached the house and stood before the impartial judge of his destiny in the judge's small office. The rancher sat at his table, facing the window, his red eyes fixed on the glowing sunset. And there he remained, despite Milligan's straightforward announcement of his presence. I need to speak with you, Mr. Selby, he said, waiting for a response. After a moment, a tone devoid of encouragement but still more civil than expected came in reply. "Since you say so, I suppose it is necessary." Unfazed and unbothered, Milligan continued, "You have already been informed of the situation between your daughter and me." "Yes," came the simple response. "Therefore I am here to formally request your consent to our engagement." The red eyes shifted from the sunset, fixing their leech-like stare on the composed face of the prospective son-in-law. "Milligan," the man said in a manner that left little room for interpretation, "I have only one answer for you. Your presence on this ranch has become offensive to me, and I would appreciate it if you would leave as soon as possible. I will refund you the money you have paid, and we can tear up your agreement," he said. "Then you won't consider my proposal?" Milligan asked. "I have already answered you," he replied. Milligan scrutinized the face in front of him, which, though mask-like, revealed a hint of the person's fiery temperament. Seeing this made him feel more justified in his own strong emotions. The person's words were a deliberate insult, and Milligan refused to tolerate insults from anyone. "Then I emphatically refuse to remove myself from this place," he responded, feigning calmness. "Furthermore, I will not accept the return of my payment. I am here for 3 years of instruction, which I have already paid for. I demand that instruction. You must understand that you have no legal or physical means to remove me, especially since it would cost you a significant amount." Milligan expected to witness a burst of anger similar to the recent one the blind man had directed at Lonnie in his presence. However, nothing of the sort occurred. The person's demeanor remained unchanged. "I'm sorry," they said, almost smiling. "You leave me no choice but to resort to a less convenient, but overall more satisfactory alternative. My daughter will have to leave. I anticipated this, and have already made arrangements for her to visit some friends 2 weeks from now for an indefinite period. You understand, Milligan, that you will not see her again. She will stay away until you leave this place. Of course, if you were to decide to follow her during this time, you surely realize that it would constitute a breach of your agreement with me. In that case, she would immediately return, and I would have complete control over the situation to keep you apart. Furthermore, I must inform you that while she is away, she will be residing in a remote settlement many miles from here, where all letters addressed to her will be opened before she receives them." The visually impaired man turned away, indicating that the meeting was over, but Milligan stood his ground, although he fully understood how thoroughly this man had outsmarted him. "At least she will be happier elsewhere," he said significantly. "I don't know," replied the other, with wicked intent. Milligan's frustration could no longer be contained. "Your behavior is inhumane, persecuting a defenseless girl. Your daughter." "Ah, my daughter. Yes?" However, the other paid no attention to the sneer. "You have no right to come between us," he continued angrily. "You have no valid reasons. I'm telling you straight up, I won't comply. When your daughter comes of age, I will take her away from this place, which is no home for her, from you who have never acted as a father to her." "True," agreed the other with irritating composure. "You will have no authority to intervene then." "The law?" "Enough of this nonsense," the rancher interrupted, displaying his first sign of impatience. "You will never marry Heather while I'm alive. Take my word for it. Now leave." And somehow, despite himself, Milligan found himself outside the house, moving towards the bunkhouse at the fastest pace his frailty would allow. However, before he reached his destination, Lonnie intercepted him, and he had little doubt that the man had witnessed him entering the house and had been waiting for his return. "Well?" he drawled, elongating his inquiry as though the anticipation of the response he would receive brought him more than ordinary satisfaction. "I suppose blind brutes are quite difficult to deal with, huh? You're planning to leave us?" Milligan was in no mood for this man's jeers. "No," he said. "On the other hand, I'm staying until my time is up." Lonnie couldn't hide his surprise and disappointment. "You're not quitting?" "No." Milligan really enjoyed seeing him uncomfortable. "And you're going?" "No." Suddenly a thought occurred to him. He could pass something on to this man. "Miss Selby is going to be sent away until I leave this ranch. Almost 3 years, Lonnie," he finished up maliciously. Lonnie stood thoughtfully, considering the other's shrunken figure. He showed no emotion, but Milligan knew he had hit him hard. "And when is she going?" he finally asked. "2 weeks from today." "Ah, 2 weeks from today." After that, Lonnie observed his rival as if assessing him in his mind, along with other things. Then he calmly said, "He'd better have sent her right now." And with this cryptic remark, he abruptly returned to his shack. Within a week, Milligan was back in the saddle. His ability to recover was astonishing, and his strength returned in a way that amazed his comrades. Fresh air and healthy work were far better remedies than anything the veterinarian had given him. And the week, at least for Milligan, was filled with significance. It was true that the rustlers had been quiet, but the consequences of their recent actions were very evident. The sheriff was now in constant contact with the ranch. Files visited William Selby frequently, having long discussions with him, and a significant fact was that his men used the place as a stopping point. He realized that the long arm of the law was actively working, and he wondered what the true objective was, as he understood that these overt movements likely concealed the actual suspicions. Both he and Joe believed that the sheriff was acting on undisclosed information, and they racked their brains trying to understand the cunning officer's motives. Then, something that Milligan had been anticipating for some time finally occurred. He hadn't seen Files in person since the Willow Bluff incident, and this had made him curious. So one day, while out on a distant pasture, rounding up a small group of young cattle, he was not at all surprised to see the sheriff, who looked like a farmer, appear over the top of a hill and ride his skinny horse down towards him. This meeting opened his eyes. He learned about the machinery that was in action, the system of spying that was happening throughout the entire region, and the cunning methods being used. He learned, among other things, about Lonnie's activities, how he was constantly in contact with a number of disreputable mixed-race individuals, and that his actions were very secretive. He also learned that his own efforts to warn before Willow Bluff had been highly appreciated, and lastly, that Files wanted him to continue working together. Agreeing to the officer's request, he was then informed of certain other things for his future guidance. And when the man had left, disappearing over the hill in the same mysterious manner he had arrived, he watched him go, and while thinking about everything he had heard, he marveled at how little he had been told, but how much had been implied, and how incredibly clever that farmer-like man truly was, despite recent failures. During those days, Milligan heard very little from Heather. The little he did hear came from Joe Nelson. Every now and then she sent him a sorrowful message mentioning her departure. She told him, even though Joe had already done so, that her father had brought Anton into the house specifically to prevent any contact with him, Milligan, and to act as a guard over her. She shared with him many things that deeply saddened him, causing him to spend countless hours writing uplifting messages to her late into the night. There was no way around it. He was incapable of doing anything more than attempting to comfort her, and he often found himself questioning whether he had made the right choice by staying on the ranch, fearing that he might be worsening her situation. Logic dictated that it was undoubtedly the best decision. If she had to leave, at the very least she would be free from Lonnie, and no matter the circumstances of the people she would be sent to, she couldn't possibly find worse company than the blind man and his partner. It was a feeble form of consolation that he clung to, and he endured many miserable hours in those final days. On one occasion, he had expressed to Joe, "If I could just see her for a few minutes, it might bring some measure of comfort to both of us." But Joe had shaken his gray head. "It's futile," he said. "You can't take any chances messing with Anton. Besides, things could be worse," he added with great emphasis. And so, Milligan had to accept his fate, uneasy, frustrated, but utterly powerless. In truth, the rancher had outsmarted him completely. Furthermore, he quickly proved that his words held weight, as Joe brought him the news, 2 days before Heather's scheduled departure, that she was making her preparations and had even begun to pack. Meanwhile, Lonnie remained in high spirits. The ranch hands couldn't recall a time when the foreman was giving them an easier time. He rarely interfered with their work, and apart from the morning roll call, they hardly saw him. He never crossed paths with Milligan. It seemed as though he had forgotten that they had ever discussed Anton. It might have been that the discussion had only been sparked in the heat of the moment, or it might have been, and Milligan thought this was much more likely, that he had ulterior motives. However, in the face of Heather's departure, the man was unusually upbeat, and the wise old Joe quickly noticed this. Whenever Joe noticed something interesting, it prompted him to inquire further, so he began to keep an eye on Lonnie, and his surveillance quickly revealed Lonnie's nighttime activities. Joe discovered that night after night Lonnie would leave the ranch, always on foot, but he would be gone for hours at a time. Twice in the past week, he didn't return until morning. All of this was quite intriguing, but nothing happened to satisfy their curiosity until the last day of Heather's stay on the ranch. That's when Lonnie paid her a visit, and taking her out of the kitchen, had a lengthy conversation with her outside. Joe watched them closely, but to his dismay, he had no way of discovering the man's intentions. Nevertheless, there was only one course of action for him to take, and he wasted no time in doing so. He rushed down to inform Milligan, who was having dinner at the bunkhouse. Taking him aside, he quickly shared the news with him, and as he concluded, he spoke with evident alarm. "Something is happening," he said, in a state of excitement that was quite out of character for him. "I can't figure out what it is. But Lonnie, he's acting strange. You see, he just went straight into his cabin. Something is definitely going on." "And didn't you ask her what it was all about?" asked Milligan, sensing the urgency in the other's tone. "Well, no. That is, I guess I mentioned it. But Miss Diane was so frustrated and kind of angry, she just went right up to her room, and I thought it best to get around here." Milligan was thinking hard, and while he thought, he stood watching the door where they had both seen Lonnie disappear. It occurred to him to go and find Heather for himself. Poor girl, she would surely tell him if there was anything wrong. After all, he had the right to know. Then he thought of Anton. Was Anton? He had turned to Joe, but his remark was cut short. Lonnie's door suddenly opened, and the foreman came hurriedly out. Joe caught his companion by the arm, and they both looked after the giant as he strode away toward the barn, and they simultaneously became aware of something unsteady in his walk. Joe was the first to draw attention to it. "Say, he's been drinking," he whispered, in an awed manner. Milligan nodded. This was something quite new. Lonnie, with all his faults, was not usually given to drink. On the contrary, he was a particularly sober man. Milligan swiftly made up his mind. "I'm going to see what's up, Joe," he said. "Do you see? He's heading for Selby's stable." It was almost dusk. The men had settled down to their evening activities. Milligan and Joe were standing alone in the shadow of the bunkhouse wall. The lamp was lit inside the building, and the glow from the window, which was quite near them, darkened the view even further. However, Milligan could still see the foreman, an unclear shadow in the growing darkness. Leaving his companion without further comment, he hurried after the disappearing man and took up his position near the barn, where he could both see and hear what might be happening. Lonnie reached the door of the stable and knocked on it in a forceful and demanding manner. Chapter 20. Driven by curiosity and anxious anticipation, Milligan didn't stay hidden in the barn for long. It was too dark to clearly see what was happening in the distance, so he approached his target. He wanted to witness everything without missing a single detail, so he cautiously stepped out into the open, not caring about the possibility of being caught in this undignified endeavor. Throughout, he couldn't shake off a sense of unpleasant foreboding, a prophetic feeling that disaster was imminent. He knew it was in the air, as if it had already occurred, leaving him powerless to do anything but helplessly observe the ruin. He had some valid reasons for his fears, but they were mostly speculative. If asked to definitively state what he expected, or who would be affected by the disaster, he wouldn't have been able to provide a convincing answer. Something made him believe that Lonnie would be at the center, the driving force. But beyond that, his thoughts were unclear. The man's mere presence at the door was irritating and hinted at possibilities. Confirmation came when the stable door abruptly swung open, revealing the agile figure of the dark-skinned half-breed, illuminated by the dull yellow light of the lantern inside. Milligan could see the man's insolent gaze directed upward at the imposing figure before him. At that moment, he couldn't help but recall everything he had heard about tough McCulloch. This recollection further intensified his unease towards the man who had come to confront him in his own territory. However, even as these thoughts raced through his mind, Lonnie's bullying, obnoxious voice reached his ears. It was unnecessarily loud, and there was a slurred quality to it that confirmed his unsteady movements. Lonnie had certainly been drinking to fortify himself. "Where were you last night, Anton?" he heard him ask. "And where should I be, Mr. Lonnie?" came the half-breed's sullen retort. "That's not an answer," the other cried in a vicious tone. The half-breed shrugged with apparent indifference, only there was no indifference in the resentful flash of his eyes. "I don't answer to you," he said in his broken way, throwing as much insolence as he could into his words. Lonnie's fury needed no urging. The spirit had wound him up to the proper pitch. "You black son of a," he cried, "you shall answer to me. For 2 pins I'd wring your damn neck, only I'm saving that for the rope. I'll tell you where you were last night. You were out with the horses. Do you hear? And you weren't at the breed camp either. I know where you were." "Guess you shoot your mouth off," Anton said with dangerous calmness. "Bah! I tell you I stay right here. I wasn't out. You're mad. Voila!" Suddenly Lonnie's hand went up as though to strike the man, but the blow did not fall. His arm dropped to his side again. For once caution saved him. Milligan felt that had the blow fallen, there might perhaps have been a sudden and desperate end to the scene. As it was, he listened to Lonnie's final words with every nerve throbbing. "You lie, you black son of a, you lie." And then he saw him swing round on his heel and stride away to the rancher's house, as if he could no longer control himself and sought safety in flight. For the moment, the watcher was so interested in the half-breed that he lost the significance of the foreman's going. Anton was still standing in the doorway, and the expression of his face was plainly visible in the lamplight. There was a sinister grin about the lower part of the features, but the black eyes were blazing with a deep fire of hatred. He watched the man leave until he reached the porch, and then suddenly, as if struck by inspiration, he sprinted into the stable. Now, Milligan understood Lonnie's intention. Lonnie had climbed onto the porch and was heading towards the house's entrance. Witnessing this, Milligan felt compelled to take immediate action. Without hesitation, he ran to warn Heather about the visit. He didn't know why he wanted to warn her, but perhaps it was due to a premonition. He was well aware that Lonnie typically waited on his boss around this time in the evening. He circled around the house, staying out of sight from its illuminated windows, and arrived at the kitchen just in time to overhear the blind man calling his daughter for a light. When Heather returned from fulfilling the request, she found him waiting for her. Initially feeling apprehensive, her fears were overcome by love, and she rushed towards him. "Jack," she whispered softly. "You're here?" He enveloped her in a bear-like embrace, and as she was about to speak, he silenced her with a shower of kisses. The sheer joy of the moment caused him to forget the purpose of his visit, and they stood heart to heart, consumed by their shared happiness, until they heard Lonnie's voice, filled with bitter curses, emanating from the office. At that moment, Milligan abruptly released her. "I had forgotten, my dear," he whispered. "No, don't shut that door." Heather had moved towards the door leading to the dining room. "Leave it open. That's why I'm here." "Why?" the girl asked, somewhat confused. "Lonnie, something is going on, and listen." They stood there, listening intently. The foreman's voice rose again, but now Selby's voice interrupted, sharp and commanding. The words were clearly audible. "Lower your voice," he said. "Do you want the girl to hear everything? You were always a klutz, Lonnie." "Klutz, huh?" But he still lowered his voice as the listeners couldn't hear anything else. "He's up to some shady business," Milligan whispered, making sure they couldn't hear any more. "Danny," he continued eagerly, "I have to sneak into the hallway and try to listen to what's going on. I need to be prepared to listen." He's cursing again. "Wait here, not a peep, not a word. There's going to be trouble." And his statement seemed reasonable enough, as the rancher's sharp tones were now mixing with the harsher tone of the other person, and both had raised their voices again. Milligan was no longer waiting for anything. He tiptoed to the door and stood listening. Then he quietly crept out into the hallway and stealthily made his way towards the blind man's office. He paused as he got closer to the open door and looked around for a hiding spot where he could see inside. The hallway was dark, with only a faint light coming from the office. There was a long, heavy coat hanging on the opposite wall, right in front of the door, and he headed towards it, crossing the hallway in the darkest area and skulking along in the shadows until he reached it. Here, he positioned it in front of him, elongating its shape while still getting a full view of the room. Lonnie wasn't visible, and Milligan deduced that he was sitting in the chair behind the door. But the blind man was directly in front of him. He was seated next to the small table by the window where the lamp was placed, a safety lamp specifically designated for his use because of his blindness. His red eyes were fixed in the direction where Milligan believed Lonnie was sitting, and the intensity of that stare was such that the watching man retreated further into his hiding spot, as if he feared the sightless eye sockets would see through his concealment. But even from this viewpoint, he found his purpose hindered. Lonnie was speaking, but his voice was so low that it only reached him in a deep growl that blurred his words into a vague murmur. So he focused his attention on the man in front of him, observing and seeking information from his expression and overall demeanor. And what he saw captivated him. Whatever control the blind man had over himself, and Milligan knew firsthand what excellent control he possessed, his expression was now completely unguarded. Every line in his hard, unyielding features exuded a cruel malevolence. His fiery eyes burned with an oddly vivid light, perhaps a reflection of the lamp on the table, and his habitually furrowed brows scowled to such an extent that the eyes beneath them resembled sparks of vibrant fire. Although he lounged comfortably in his chair, devoid of energy or alertness, with one arm resting on the table beside him and his outstretched fingers lazily drumming a pattern on the bare wood, his breath came in quick, shallow gasps, contradicting his demeanor. If Milligan had only seen what lay behind the closed door, he would have been startled, even alarmed. The inflamed Lonnie was oblivious to everything except his own objective. His mind was solely focused on the subject of his conversation, blocking out all else. At that moment, he held no fear of the blind man. There was none of the submission he had previously displayed in Milligan's presence. It was the spirit he had absorbed that had bolstered him for the time being. It's likely that Lonnie, in that instant, harbored no fear of either man or devil. And though Milligan couldn't make out a single word, his speech was boastful, domineering, and carried a strong essence of alcohol. Nevertheless, there was also an unwavering determination within it. "There's no option for you, Selby," Lonnie was saying. "You've never given me an option, and I'm not going to be such a fool as to give you one. God almighty, Selby, there never was a man treated as I've been by you. We've been together for ages, I guess. Way back in those old days, when we were friends, before you were blind, before you were against almost everybody, when we fought against those blackbacks in the Indies side by side, when we argued and made up. I liked you, Selby, and I worked honestly with you. There was nothing mean to you then, except handing out dollars. I had no complaints in those days. I worked for what I was owed, and I received it. I didn't ask for more, and I guess I didn't want it. That's all right. Then you went blind and you changed. That's where the problem began. I was no better than the rest to you. You forgot everything that had happened. You forgot that I was fair to you, and since then I've been treated poorly by you. Pshaw. There's no use in talking. You know these things just as well as I do. But you could have given me a chance. You could have treated me fairly. It was in your best interest. I would have stayed with you. I would have done right by you. And I would have been genuinely sorry when you died. But that kind of thing doesn't matter to me anymore. What I want, I'm going to have, and you have to give it, you hear? It's not a question of permission now. I'm telling you right here that I want your girl. The man paused, but Selby remained calm. He still tapped on the table, only his hand had moved closer to the lamp, and the steady tapping of his fingers was slightly louder, as if more nervous energy was unconsciously being released through the movement. "So you want my girl," he said, barely parting his lips to let his voice pass. "Yeah," Lonnie said emphatically. "I want that girl like I saved her from drowning once. You remember? You said she fell overboard, after I pulled her back onto the ship away from the sharks. That's what you said afterwards." He paused significantly. If he had expected any reaction from the person listening, He must have been disappointed. The other remained completely still, except for their fingers moving closer and closer to the lamp. "Go on." "Well, I've told you where I stand, and I've told you where you stand," Lonnie continued, with his voice slightly raised. He felt that the other person was too relaxed, and, in his unimaginative way, he thought he had spoken too gently. "And I say again, I want that girl to be my wife. There was a time when you would have been happy to be rid of her around the time she fell overboard. If you were ready to part then, why not now? I'm going to get her, and what do I give in return? You know, you'll continue ranching in peace. I'll even stay as your foreman if you want. I'll completely stop the business we both know about, and you won't have anything to worry about. It's a fair and honest deal." A fair and honest deal. Very generous. Even Lonnie could sense the sarcasm, and his anger immediately flared up. But he paid no attention to those fingers that had now moved to touch the brass body of the lamp. "I'm waiting for your answer," he said sharply. Milligan now heard his words for the first time. "Take it easy, Lonnie. Take it easy," replied the rancher. "I like to fully understand the situation. You explained it so well." The sarcasm had grown fiercer due to the rancher's self-restraint. And this self-restraint was further evident in the movement of the hand which had now settled itself upon the body of the lamp, and held onto it nervously. Lonnie no longer kept control over himself, and his response came in a shout. "You shall accept my price, or—" "Stay calm, you clumsy idiot," the blind man hissed between his clenched teeth. "No, you don't, Mr. Damn Selby!" cried Lonnie, jumping to his feet and moving threateningly to the center of the room. "No, you don't!" he cried again. "I've had enough of that. God's curse on you for a despicable person. I won't talk any more. It's yes or no. Remember," he leaned over toward the sitting man and pointed in his face with intense satisfaction, "I am your master now, and if you don't do as I say, by God, I'll make you beg for mercy." And Selby's response came with a crash of metal and breaking glass, a burst of flame, then darkness, as he threw the lamp to the floor and put it out. It happened in silence, but a silence disturbed by the sound of sudden movement. It happened, as was only to be expected from a man like him, without warning, like the quiet attack of a mountain lion, and with deadly intent. Milligan couldn't see anything, but he knew that death was hanging over that room for someone. Suddenly he heard the table dragged or pushed across the floor, and Lonnie's voice, harsh with the effort of struggle, reached him. "You would you? Fine. It's you or me." At that moment the observer was about to rush forward, for what purpose he had only a vague idea. But just as he took the first step, he felt himself forcefully grabbed by the arm from behind, and Heather's voice whispered in his ear. "Not you, Jack," she said eagerly. "Leave it to me. I can save him, Lonnie," Heather exclaimed. "Lonnie?" Milligan questioned. "Yes," she replied. She swiftly disappeared and reappeared with the illuminated kitchen lamp, holding it up as she entered the room. Milligan was completely caught off guard. The girl's actions were sudden and unexpected, and her words were peculiar. She stood in the middle of the room, resembling a statue, with the light raised above her head. The evidence of a violent struggle surrounded her. Lonnie sought refuge behind the window table, blinking in the sudden brightness, staring at her in utter astonishment. However, the most captivating figure in the room was the blind man. He groped along the opposite edge of the table, displaying a pitiful helplessness, yet snarling with impotent and frustrated rage. His right hand still clutched the handle of a menacing double-edged hunting knife, its tip dripping with blood. Suddenly he turned fiercely towards the girl. While he had been momentarily silenced and confounded, his voice now erupted in a fit of fury. "You wretched woman!" he shouted, moving as if to attack her. Milligan was about to come to her aid, but at that precise moment the man's attention was abruptly diverted. Lonnie recognized his opportunity and headed for the door. With a vehement curse, the blind man lunged at him as he departed, only to collide with the table and stumble nearly to the ground. Seizing the chance, Heather swiftly followed Lonnie, slamming the door behind her and promptly turning the key. Heather had revealed a new side of herself. Her quick thinking was astonishing, and the entire sequence of events unfolded so rapidly that Milligan struggled to fully comprehend its significance. Lonnie had not noticed his presence,
In a blind rush, he had made his way to the hallway door and exited. The only thing that felt real to Milligan was Heather's safety, and he grabbed her arm to take her to the kitchen. However, the girl's readiness allowed no time to be wasted.
"No," she whispered urgently. "Leave me and follow Lonnie. Joe is in the kitchen and will protect me if necessary. Hurry!" she continued, stomping her foot in excitement. "Go! Make sure he's all right. There must be no killing here." And much against his wishes, Milligan was compelled to leave her. In that moment, Heather had reached a level of alertness and preparedness that was impossible to resist. Without a word, he departed through the front door. Lonnie had already left the porch, and under the moonlight, Milligan could see him descending the hill towards his cabin. He followed him swiftly. However, he arrived too late. The entire incident unfolded right before his eyes, while he was still too far away to prevent the heartless act, before his warning shout could be of any use. He witnessed a figure dart out from the rancher's stable. He saw it stop and stand. He saw an arm extend, and he realized and shouted to Lonnie. The foreman stood, turned, a gunshot echoed, and he collapsed face down. Milligan rushed forward, but before he could reach him, 2 more shots resounded, and a 3rd bullet whizzed past his own head. He sprinted towards the person who had fired them. He now recognized him. It was Anton. However, the half-breed, swift on his feet, had reached the stable where a horse stood ready with a saddle. Milligan watched as he effortlessly mounted the horse and disappeared into the nearby woods. Finally, he abandoned the pursuit and ran back to the fallen man. Kneeling by his side, he lifted his large, powerful head. The man was alive, and he shouted to the men at the bunkhouse for help. But even as he called, Lonnie spoke. "It's no good," he said in a hoarse tone. "I'm done up by that lying son of a tough McCulloch. I should have known. Guess I pissed him off." He paused as the sound of running feet came from the bunkhouse, and Arizona's voice was calling to know Milligan's whereabouts. Then the foreman's large frame gave a shiver. "Quick, Milligan," he said, in a voice that had suddenly grown faint. "There ain't much time. Listen, go to Widow Dangley's place tonight at 2 a.m. There came a rattle of flowing blood in his throat, which blurred anything else he had to say, but he had said enough. Milligan understood. When Arizona came up, Lonnie, who was once the bully of Fly Bend, had passed over the one-way trail. He died shot in 3 places, twice in the chest and once in the stomach. Anton, or rather Tough McCulloch, had done his work with all the consummate skill for which he had once been so notorious. And as something of this flashed through Milligan's brain, another thought came with it, prompted by the presence of Arizona, who was now on his knees beside him. "It's Anton. Arizona," he said. "Lonnie pissed him off. He shot him and has run away through the woods back there, riding one of Selby's horses. He's heading for the hills. Quick, here, listen. The others are coming. You know Tough McCulloch? Well?" There was an ominous tone in Arizona's voice. "You'd like to find him?" "More than anything. Anton is Tough McCulloch." "Who told you?" "Lonnie here. I didn't mention it before because... Did you say the hills?" Arizona had risen to his feet. There was no emotion in his manner. They might have been discussing the most ordinary topic. Now the rest of the men crowded around, and Milligan heard the rancher's voice calling from the porch to inquire into the meaning of the shots. However, ignoring the others, he replied to the cowpuncher's question. "Yes," he said. "Let's go. See ya." The 2 guys shook hands, and Arizona disappeared in the dim light, heading towards the barn, and the lifeless Lonnie was carried by rough yet tender hands into his own small house. And there wasn't a single one of those guys who wouldn't have been willing and eager to assist him, if assistance had been feasible. Even on the open grassland, death makes up for many things that are considered unbearable in life. Chapter 21. Inside the cabin, where Lonnie had long been in control, the boys gathered around the bed on which their former oppressor lay. The strong, rugged men were filled with shock at the severity of the attack. Lonnie Harnack, the ranch's feared figure, defeated. The idea was mind-boggling. Milligan calmly removed the clothing from the deceased man's upper body to expose the wounds for the doctor's examination, with Raw Harris standing close by. It was during this process that Milligan discovered another wound. Raw Harris noticed it too, and immediately drew attention to it. "I reckon I heard 4 gunshots," he remarked. Say that Anton character was quite a troublemaker. 4 shots, and all of them hit their target. This one here seems to be just a scratch. Might have been made by a knife, it's so clean. Yes, sir, he was a real threat, no doubt about it. Since no one seemed inclined to dispute the claim that Anton was a troublemaker, and as the matter of whether there were 3 or 4 gunshots held no significant interest for the bystanders, the topic was disregarded. Only Milligan found it worthy of contemplation. He knew that the 4th wound was not inflicted by the half-breed. He recalled the rancher's knife and its blood-stained tip, as well as Lonnie's exclamation, "You would you?" No further explanation was needed. While the 2 men continued their task, there was a slight commotion at the open doorway. The silent spectators moved aside, creating a makeshift pathway to the bedside, and William Selby made his way through them, accompanied by the steady tap-tap of his cane. Milligan looked around with a mix of emotions when he heard the familiar sound. He stared at the man as if he were observing a terrifying predator, captivated against his own will. It was difficult to determine which feeling prevailed in that moment. Surprise, disgust, anticipation, and even a hint of fear all battled for dominance, and this amalgamation kept him silent, waiting for whatever that detestable presence had in store. He could have easily denounced him right then and there, but it would have served no purpose, and likely caused more harm than good. Therefore, he settled for gazing intently into the man's fiery, enigmatic eyes, a level of focus he had never before bestowed upon them, and as he looked, the horror of the scene in the office washed over him once more, sending shivers down his spine. "Where is he? Where is Lonnie?" the visually impaired man inquired, accurately pausing at the bedside. The question was not directed at anyone in particular, but Milligan took it upon himself to respond. "He is lying on the bed in front of you," he coldly stated. The man swiftly turned towards him. "Ah, Milligan," he uttered. Then he leaned over the bed, his hands searching the lifeless body until they came into contact with the drying blood around the stomach wound. With a gesture of repulsion, he recoiled. "He's not dead?" he questioned, his curiosity tinged with an odd eagerness, turning to those around him. "Yes, he is deceased," Milligan replied, unintentionally imbuing his words with solemnity. Who did it?" The question was posed in a tense, urgent voice, even sharper and more eager than the previous one. "Anton," the men chorused, as if finding solace in breaking their long silence with this revelation. The crime was not as important as the culprit's personality. They were all thinking about Anton, so they mentioned his name without hesitation. "Anton? Where is he? Did you catch him?" The rancher turned around and spoke to everyone. "Anton stole one of your horses," said Milligan. "I tried to catch him, but he was too far ahead. I was on foot." "Well, why are you all still here? Don't any of you have the sense to go after him?" "Arizona is going after him, and until the sheriff arrives, that's enough. He won't lose his trail." Milligan's last remark clearly conveyed a significant message. The rancher responded sharply. "What do you mean?" "Arizona doesn't like Anton." "Ah, and Lonnie. Who discovered him? Who was there when he died?" Selby stared at Milligan's face, and Milligan didn't hesitate to tailor his response to his own intentions. "I found him dead. Completely dead. His death must have been instant." "I see." Selby turned back to the bed. The rancher stood silently over the dead man for a few minutes. Then, to Milligan's horror, he started lamenting in a low voice, filled with hypocritical pity. The words made Milligan want to grab him by the throat and stop him from speaking. "My poor old Lonnie," he said with endless pity. "Poor old Lonnie," he repeated, sadly addressing the deceased. "I wish I'd listened to your advice about that scoundrel and gotten rid of him. And to think that you were the one he betrayed. I wonder how it happened. It must have been because of your rough temper. Milligan," he cried, pointing at the lifeless body on the bed. "There lies the most loyal and only friend I've ever had. That man stood by me when everyone else abandoned me. Yes, we fought alongside each other in the Indian days. Yeah, and even further back. I remember when he would have defended me with his life, poor Lonnie. I guess he had his flaws, just like most of us do. Yeah, and I bet his temper got him into trouble with Anton. Poor old Lonnie.
I suppose we'll never know the truth about this." He paused. Then he exclaimed angrily, "Damn it! Guys, each and every one of you, I'll give $1,000 to whoever brings Anton back, dead or alive. I prefer dead, so he won't get away from us. $1,000. Now who?" But Milligan couldn't bear it any longer. "Don't bother, Mr. Selby," he said coldly. "There's no point in offering rewards. The person who went after Anton will find him, and you can be sure they won't take anything from you for that. You may not know Arizona, but I do." "You're confident," the other replied, immediately resentful. "I have every reason to be," came the firm response. Selby shook his closely cropped head. His resentment had disappeared from his demeanor once again. He had few moods that he couldn't control at will. That's how it seemed to Milligan. "I truly hope it turns out as you say, but I still have doubts. However," he continued in a lighter tone, "in the meantime, there's work to be done. The doctor needs to be called. Send someone for the doctor and sheriff first thing tomorrow morning, Milligan. There's no point in bothering them tonight. The sheriff has his night shift to do, and he wouldn't appreciate us waking him up now. Plus, nothing can be done until daylight, and the doctor is only needed to confirm. Poor old Lonnie." He walked away with something very similar to a sigh. Halfway to the door, he stopped. "Milligan, you take charge of things tonight. Lock this door. And," he added with increased seriousness, "are you certain Arizona will pursue that man until he is caught?" "Absolutely," Milligan said with a grim smile. He believed he understood the determination. There was a moment of silence. Then the cane tapped, and the rancher left under the curious gaze of his men. Milligan also watched him go. There was no longer any doubt about his emotions. He knew that no one suspected his presence in the house during Selby's murderous attack on Lonnie.
And Selby, the deceitful hypocrite that he was trying to cover his tracks. Milligan despised the wicked villain more than he had ever thought possible. Throughout his thoughts, there was a cold, unyielding sense of triumph that was completely alien to his nature, but completely in line with his feelings toward the man he was dealing with. As William Selby departed, the men remained silent, even after the distant tapping of his cane had faded away. Milligan looked around at his brave comrades with a sense of delight in his eyes. Joe was not present, which pleased him. The loyal little fellow was at his post, taking care of Heather. Now he turned to Harris. "Raw," he said. "Would you be willing to ride to the doctor's?" "He said tomorrow," the man objected. "I know. But if you would do me a favor, you will ride to warn the doctor tonight, and then ride out to Widow Dangley's to meet us all there, hiding in the vicinity." The man stared. Every person in the room instantly became interested. Something in Milligan's tone had sparked a glimmer of hope in their eyes, which he was glad to see. "What is it?" Jacob asked eagerly. "Yes," Raw protested. "No deceiving." "I do not deceive," Milligan quickly responded. "I am completely serious. Listen, boys. I want each of you to leave quietly, one by one. It is 8 miles to Widow Dangley's. Make sure you arrive there by 1:30 in the morning, and do not forget your firearms." "There's a large bluff next to the house," he suggested meaningfully. "I'll be there, and so will the sheriff and all his men. I think there will be a commotion and we might succeed, but I can't provide any further details. I didn't bother asking Selby for permission. You remember what he said previously. We won't risk telling him anything." "I'm fully committed," said Raw decisively. "I suppose we don't want any restrictions on this plan." "Let's just get going," said Jacob calmly. And after that, the men exited one by one, and when the last person had left, Milligan extinguished the lamp and locked the door. Then he quietly sneaked up to the kitchen and looked in through the window. Heather was there, as was Joe, with 2 guns hanging from his belt. He had no trouble capturing their attention. There was no wasting time during this visit. He brushed off the eager questions from the girl and simply gave her a calm warning. "Stay up all night, dear," he said, "but don't let your father find out." To Joe, he said, "Joe, if you fall asleep at all tonight, I'll never forgive you." Then he hurried away, confident that neither of them would disappoint him, and went to the barn. Without a word, almost without a sound, he saddled the Lady Jezebel. Once his mare was ready, he gazed up at the rancher's house for a long and intense moment. He was contemplating the risk he was taking, not the general risk, but the risk of success
or failure in his mission. He waited until all the lights had been turned off and the house appeared as a mere black silhouette in the moonlight. Then he disappeared back into the barn and soon re-emerged, leading his unruly mare. A few moments later, he rode off quietly, and the way he left brought a sinister smile to his lips, for he remembered the eerie movements of the night riders that he had witnessed. His path diverged from that of his comrades. Instead of following the trail like they did, he skirted the upper enclosure and pastures and ventured into the dark pine forests behind the house. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The Widow Dangley's farmhouse appeared much larger under the moonlight than it actually was. Everything was illuminated, adorned with a peculiar silvery shine that blinded the eyes, causing shadows to appear as towering structures and distorting the buildings themselves. Her dwelling was simply cozy and unassuming. The ranch was situated in a narrow valley where a small stream murmured its way towards the Fly River, about 4 miles away. The valley was one of those sharp grooves that are abundant in the prairie, completely concealed and unmarked from the surrounding land, remaining unsuspected until stumbled upon directly. It resembled a furrow carved by nature's plow, designed to serve as drainage for the neighboring plains. It meandered in an irregular path, stretching east and west, a labyrinth of undergrowth, prominent bluffs, low red sand banks, and crumbling gravel cliffs, all scattered in abundance, as if nature had been wasteful amidst the vast grasslands. The house stood on the northern slope, shielded on 3 sides by a protective line of pine trees.
To the right of it stood the outbuildings, and finally, 150 yards away from the rest, concealed within the bluff, were the enclosures, instead of being conveniently visible from the house, as is typical. Undoubtedly, Widow Dangley was a trusting individual, and so Milligan, despite his relative lack of experience, thought to himself as he surveyed the moonlit panorama from atop his mare. He was accompanied by Sheriff Files, and the 2 men were assessing the likelihood of success against potential invaders. "What time is it?" asked the sheriff, after a few moments of silent contemplation of the scene. "You have 30 minutes to position your forces." "Ah, there's one of your comrades riding down the opposite bank." Milligan pointed across the valley. "Yes, and there's another further down," Files observed calmly. "And here's one descending to your right, all on schedule. How about your men?" "They should be in that bluff supporting the corrals." "How many?" 4, including the cook." 4 and 16 of mine make 20. The 2 of us make 22. "Good. Let's go." The man led the way to the bluff. The cowboys were all there. They received instructions to hold the position at the corrals, to defend them, or to act as reinforcements if the conflict should occur elsewhere. Then the 2 leaders moved on down into the valley. It was a challenging descent, steep, and with a loose surface that sloped beneath their horses' hooves. For the moment, a cloud had covered the moon, and Files looked up. A southwest breeze had arisen, and there was a hazy appearance to the sky. "Excellent," he said again, in his abrupt manner. "There won't be too much moonlight. Moonlight is not completely advantageous in a situation like this. We must rely mainly on surprise. We don't want too many empty saddles." At the bottom of the valley they found the remainder of the men gathered together in the shelter of the scattered undergrowth. It was Files's entire command. He immediately proceeded to divide them into 2 groups. One he positioned east of the ranch, arranged in a sort of skirmish formation, to act under Milligan's supervision. The other group he took under his own command, selecting a favorable position to the west. He had also established a system of signals to be used when the enemy approached. These signals took the form of the screech owl's cry. So within 15 minutes of their arrival, everything was ready for the raiders, and the valley returned to its usual tranquility. And how quiet and still it was. The time moved closer to the appointed hour. The moon was still high in the sky, but its light had become more uncertain. The clouds had grown thick and stormy. Every now and then the rippling waters of the brook would briefly catch and reflect a passing beam of light, creating a silvery streak in the valley, but otherwise everything was shadowy. And in the occasional moonlight,
Every tree, bush, and boulder seemed to transform into strange, ghostly shapes, distorting reality into grotesque illusions, turning even the smallest plants into anything from a grazing cow to a moving vehicle, from a wandering coyote to a log cabin. The sounds of the night creatures filled the fragrant air, emphasizing the calm and peacefulness. It was like a magical realm, filled with indistinct melodies that enchanted the ear without becoming monotonous, and populated by shadows that could be shaped by one's imagination. But in their eagerness for the moment, the waiting men overlooked all of this. To them, it was a potential battlefield. From a defensive perspective, it was a strategic position, and they were satisfied with it. The cattle, released from the enclosures, had to pass through the valley either going up or down. Similarly, any number of men had to approach from one of these two directions, making the ambush unavoidable. Finally, the warning signal arrived. An owl hooted from somewhere further up the valley, its cry rising in a strange rhythm and fading away slowly. And simultaneously, there came the sound of a distant rumble, like the steady hum of machinery at some far-off point. Milligan immediately gave up his watch on the east and focused all attention on the west. One of his own men had responded to the owl's cry, and a third screech came from the guard at the corrals. The rumble grew louder. There were no moving objects visible yet, but the increasing sound was less of a murmur. It was more detached, and the straining ears clearly made out the clatter of hooves, evidently traveling fast down the valley trail. On they came, steadily pounding out their rhythm with precise sharpness. It was a moment of intense excitement for those awaiting the approach, but only a moment, although the sensation lasted longer. The moon suddenly illuminated the whole thing. Suspense was banished with its revealing light, and each man, steadfast at his post, gripped his rifle or pistol, ready to unleash a deadly fire the moment the command should be given. A troop of about 18 horsemen dashed around a bend of the valley and plunged into the ambush. Instantly, Files's voice rang out. "Stop, or we shoot!" he cried. The horsemen immediately halted, but the response was a gunshot in the direction from where his voice had sounded. The defiance was Milligan's signal. He relayed the order to his men, and a volley of rifle fire rang out immediately, and chaos ensued among the ranks of the horsemen. Then the battle began in deadly seriousness. The sheriff's men quickly mounted their horses and advanced both in front and behind the trapped raiders. And the cowboys came racing down from the corrals to throw themselves into the melee, shouting and yelling as only men of their profession can. The fight intensified, but the odds were in favor of the ambush. The overcast sky provided little assistance to either side. Every now and then, the peeping moon gazed upon the scene as if hesitant to fully reveal itself, and it was under those fleeting rays that the sheriff's men aimed their rifles and unleashed their deadly gunfire. However, the raiders were formidable opponents. They fought desperately and were skilled in the use of their weapons. Their initial confusion quickly dissipated, and they charged straight at Milligan's defensive line with a determination that seemed poised to overpower it and create a path through. But the arrival of the cowboys halted the onslaught and pushed them back towards Files's group behind them. Numerous riderless horses escaped amidst the chaos, not only those belonging to the raiders. One of the deputies had fallen from his saddle right next to Milligan, and it was impossible to tell in the darkness how many others had suffered a similar fate. Red Mask's gang had been effectively caught in a trap, and both sides were prepared to fight until the end. Throughout all this, both Milligan and Files were searching for the leader, the person they most desired to capture. However, the darkness, which had initially favored the ambush, now thwarted their efforts. In the midst of the chaotic struggle, it was challenging enough to differentiate friend from foe, let alone identify any specific individual. The ranks of the deputies had closed in tightly, and a desperate hand-to-hand battle ensued. Milligan found himself caught in the midst of the tumult, his unruly mare having carried him there against his will. Yet, if she had led him into grave danger, she was also prepared to fight on his behalf. She struck with great force, charging forward and rearing up, attempting to overcome every obstacle in her path. This allowed her master to evade numerous shots, even though he could do little more than fire aimlessly himself. In this frenzied manner, the enraged creature forcefully made her way through the midst of the battle, and her rider was carried away to the outer edges. Then she attempted to escape with him, but just in the nick of time, before her strong teeth had clamped onto the bridle, he successfully steered her back towards the struggling crowd. With furious abandon, she charged ahead, and unfortunately, her wild trajectory resulted in the worst possible outcome. She collided forcefully with the sheriff's horse, while its rider was in the midst of aiming his gun at a man wearing a red mask. The impact nearly caused both horses and riders to fall to the ground. The mare was thrown onto her hindquarters, while Files, cursing vehemently, desperately clung to his saddle to maintain his position. However, his aim was lost, and his shot narrowly missed his horse's head. Before either he or Milligan could regain their composure, the man with the red mask had disappeared into the darkness, heading towards the treacherous ascent of the valley slope. Filled with terror, Lady Jezebel swiftly turned around on her hindquarters and charged down the valley. As she galloped away, Milligan had the somewhat dubious satisfaction of witnessing the sheriff detach himself from the crowd and chase after the outlaw. Now fueled by his own anger, and even though the mare had taken control with the bit in her mouth, he fought against her with a fury equal to her own. He knew she held all the power, but he refused to surrender. He would rather kill her than allow her to escape with him this time. And so, since nothing else seemed to have any effect on her, he swiftly grabbed a pistol from its holster, leaned over, and forcefully struck the side of her head with the butt of the weapon in a desperate attempt to change her course. At first, she paid no attention to his punches. That's how crazy she was. But soon enough, she winced and turned her head away, and her body reacted accordingly. In no time, he had turned her around, and as she faced the side of the valley where the attacker had disappeared, he ruthlessly slashed her with his spurs. In an instant, the sounds of the battle were left behind, and the mare, with agile leaps, was climbing up the slope, and Milligan only focused on the man he was chasing. His own safety or the safety of his mare meant nothing to him at that moment. Through him, or through the mare, they had lost Red Mask. He needed to correct that mistake. He had no idea how. His mind could only think of one thing: pursuit. And he was grateful for the reliable horse beneath him. Nothing hindered her. She gracefully maneuvered around every obstacle. A steep bank didn't scare her. She charged at it with her powerful hooves until the gravel and sand slid away, leaving her with a foothold. She trampled down bushes or charged through them. Blindly she raced toward the top, at an angle that made her rider hold onto the horn of his saddle to avoid sliding off the back. They passed Files, who was struggling to reach the top. The Lady Jezebel seemed to zoom past him, leaving him behind, and as they went, Milligan shouted, "How much of a head start does he have?" "He's well ahead now," the sheriff replied, and the response ignited Milligan's excitement, prompting him to dig both spurs into the mare's flanks once again. The top of the hill appeared against the sky. A thick line of bushes stood in their way. With her head down and her nose almost touching the ground, the frenzied animal plunged into it. Her rider barely had enough time to lie down in the saddle and hold onto her neck. His thoughts were in a sort of mental whirlpool, and he barely realized what had happened, when, the next moment, the frenzied demon under him plunged out onto the open prairie. She made no pause or hesitation, but like a bullet from a gun zoomed straight ahead, her nose alone guiding her. She still held the reins in her mouth. Her playful behavior had only just begun. Milligan looked ahead and scanned the horizon, but the darkness obscured all signs of his target. He had just decided to rely on chance and the unpredictable mood of his mare when the moon, crossing a gap in the clouds, gave him a brief view of the horizon as if from a flashlight. It only lasted a few seconds, but it lasted long enough for him to spot a horseman heading towards the Fly River, off to the right, at a distance that appeared to be over a mile. His heart sank at the prospect, but in the next moment, hope sprang within him as the mare instinctively turned and prepared herself for the race. He understood. She had recognized the possibility of companionship, and few horses, regardless of their temperament, can resist that. He leaned over and patted her shoulder, lightening her load like a jockey. "Now, you devilish creature," he whispered affectionately, "behave yourself for once and go like the devil you are."